Okay, welcome to our free GRE prep hour for December 12th, 2024. I'm Dimitri. Today's topic is vocab questions, and specifically, I'm going to talk about prediction and which direction to go based on the cues in the sentence. How can we tell from our direction markers whether we want um, a word that matches what we've seen, that goes against what we've seen, that has some other subtle relationship there, and that's a really common issue that comes up when we're trying to predict. Most commonly when people are studying vocab questions, they emphasize the vocab part of it. Let me learn as many words as I can. That's great. That's not something a teacher can do as much for you on. You just have to learn a lot of words. But I would say it's also the smaller part of it. It's really common that I'll see people who, it doesn't matter how many of the words they know because they don't know what they're looking for. And if you don't know what you're looking for, it's very hard to get it right other than by chance. Um, and even when we do have to work around difficult vocabulary, we want those predictions well in place. Sometimes we can use the predictions to get rid of some of the words that we know can't fit. And then even if we don't know all the words that are left, we can make a more informed guess out of what's left. So important strategy to have in place. So we'll talk about that today in the context of both text completion and sentence equivalence, which are the two vocabulary-based question types on the GRE, with an emphasis on prediction, and then direction markers and the content clues that relate to them. Uh, Pretty much everything you see today will be out of our 5-pound book of practice problems with a few adjustments. So you can get this book if you need a whole bunch of extra problems to do outside of your official guide. So we'll just get started doing some. Since I know some of you are pretty new to this and some are not, I just want to start by doing a couple of questions. So we'll start with a text completion. In some ways, this is the most straightforward type of question. We're just going to fill in the blank. What word would fill in this blank? There's some method to it, and we want to try to be able to predict, and I want to work on our prediction skills today. But that's definitely the idea. So I'm going to put up a poll and have you pull in your answer to this one when you have it. So just select a letter from the poll that's about to pop up when you have your answer. And if you're watching this as a recording, try to write something down before we go over the answers. Okay, take a moment to try this out. Okay, so that's about our target time on these. Usually we're shooting for just over a minute, about a minute and a quarter on these, depending on the length. If it has 3 blanks, we might run a little longer than if it has 1 blank, and they can vary from anywhere from 1 to 3. But in the minute range is usually kind of what we want. So if you haven't put an answer in, go ahead and put one. Looks like we're split between a couple answers. So what I want to do is clarify a little bit what these questions are asking us to do. I think what's really common, and I don't think we always realize we're doing it, but what's really common is that people will go and fill in a word in advance before they finish reading the sentence. And then they'll finish reading the sentence, but they won't realize that they've already made up their mind. Right? It's like we do with people, right? Maybe before someone has a chance to say much, I've already decided whether I like them or not. And maybe I have some basis for that, but maybe it's not a full proper assessment that I'm making. And so I want to be very mindful of that as I go through. No pun intended about mindfulness here. So notice that if I don't read the second half of the sentence, if I stop at the semicolon, I'm going to get myself in trouble. And this is really a common setup that we have some kind of colon or semicolon. A semicolon, as you might know, is basically like a period. It indicates a full stop, but it's a full stop where there is a connection between the two pieces. And so usually what you're going to see when you have a semicolon and then a whole other thing is that whole other thing is going to be the content clue that we need to figure out what we know about the semicolon. So if we read before this, we see, contrary to the assumptions that many Westerners hold about mindfulness practices, meditation is often anything but blank. And the problem is that it could be pretty much any of these. You might not know all these words, but if all I know is that it has to go against assumptions that people have, I might know what assumptions I have about meditation, or I might know what assumptions I think other people are making. Now I'm assuming about assuming. So I would just have to say, hey, contrary to the assumptions, this. So maybe I'd say, oh, like meditation's not mystical, right? People think of meditation as like ooh, glowing orbs and stuff like that, and it's not like that. But I don't know if that's what the assumption is they're talking about because I haven't read the rest. So I really want to avoid doing this kind of thing. And that's where I'm just going to get an answer like that. Or I might get an answer like, hey, beneficial. Just like, hey, people think it's good, but it's really not. And certainly the sentence could go on to say that. They could say, 80% of people who meditate, make themselves worse off that way or something like that. If the sentence could say that, but it doesn't, right? So what does it say? It says, while using various methods to calm the mind, so it talks about calming, meditators frequently experience intense periods of restlessness and doubt. So, okay, so what are we having? We're trying to calm down, but we have restlessness and doubt. So if that's the case, what can we say? Forget these words. These words are fancy. Using none of these words, just using a plain word. What would we say? Meditation is anything but what? What is meditation not, according to this sentence? Yeah, it's not chill. It's not relaxing. You could even reuse the word they had calm and say calm or calming, right? Uh, so chill, relaxing, calming, doesn't matter which one you pick. You don't get extra points for fancy words. Sometimes it's fun if we predict a word and then that's the answer. But that's not our goal. We're just trying to understand what kind of word we. So basically, they're saying, look, meditation seems really calming, and it can be. I'm sure the author isn't trying to say it never is, but often it's not. Often it has these other effects, right? And so we want something that means that. Now, if I don't know all these words, I might not feel really good about that. So what do I want to avoid? I want to avoid other words that are nice but don't mean calming, right? Like look at beneficial. Beneficial just means it's good for you, right? Like, eating your vitamins is beneficial, taking your vitamins, whatever. Um, you know, whatever. Something's beneficial to you financially, right? But it's not saying what kind of benefit, right? Maybe having this restlessness and doubt is beneficial for you. There's nothing about being mystical. Orthodox, let's hold on to that. What is orthodox even? Benign is positive, I think, right? So that I might hold on to that. Halcyon for a lot of folks is an unknown. So I'm going to kind of say, hey, orthodox, that's kind of strange. Let me squiggle that one. Benign seems like it's good. So maybe halcyon, maybe it's just a full blank. Maybe I just don't know what it is. Now talk to me about orthodox. I think the most common way we use that is in religion, right? Like Orthodox Judaism, something like that. But what would orthodox mean when you're in the context of meditation? What would that entail to be orthodox? Sure, standard, like following the rules, mainstream, traditional, right? So if you think about what orthodox religion means, right? Like my ancestors were rabbis, right? So if I lived that way, right? I would be following the codes that they followed. I would be doing, all the things just as they're set down, right? And people can disagree about what those are and blah blah blah, right? But that's the idea. You can see it outside of religion. Like people will say, "Oh, the predictions they made for this stock go against market orthodoxy," right? It's not what people standardly say the market's going to do, something like that. So we're not talking about breaking free from tradition or from standards. We're not talking about doing things like against the rules or not by the book. And so we're not saying that meditation isn't following the rules, right? We're just saying that meditation can kind of like scramble us and freak us out a little bit, that it's not always chill. Benign makes some sense, but notice what benign is. It's just a very bland, like okay word, right? Benign isn't always even good. Like if you have a benign tumor, it's not good for you. It's just not cancer, right? It's not going to harm you necessarily, but it's not like you want a tumor. And so benign can also just mean kind of just like, not a problem. Um, And that might get us to halcyon even if we don't know it. So if we know that halcyon is like peaceful, relaxing, then that makes sense. It often gets used in other ways, like in my halcyon days or something like that. But here it's just a stand-in, a fancy stand-in for, like we said, relaxing, calm, peaceful. Okay. And so even if I don't know the word, I might get there by process of elimination, saying, hey, these don't do it. And what you'll really commonly see is a word like benign that seems like, yeah, that's kind of good, but it doesn't mean the specific thing I want. Or a word like orthodox or mystical that has something to do with the content of religion, prayer, meditation, things like that, but that doesn't get at the specific point they're making, right? Someone might just grab it if they saw it was about meditation. Sure, mystical, yeah, but they haven't really read this sentence and thought about it. And so the GRE puts those in as traps. So a couple of things we want to think about are what are our specific clues? And I distinguish them into two types of clues, right? We have content clues, right? What, you know, what information or ideas is the blank about? Versus direction markers, which is like which way are we going? And that can be complicated because we can go in more than one direction, and we might have some subtleties. So I'll kind of show you some things that the GRE is not doing, and then we can look at more realistically what the GRE is doing. Um, so let's do a couple that the GRE would not do. So just take a moment to look over these. I'm not going to give you answer choices on these, but just to get the idea of filling it. Okay, so this first one about the porridge. The jury is not going to give you this. Why not? Yeah, it's pretty direct and basic, right? There's really only one word it can be. If it's just right, it's not too hot or too cold. It'd be weird if it's like neither too hot nor too offensive or something like that, right? It's like, no, 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 like that's what it has to be. So it's not even just that it's easy. You might find some of them easy. It's also that the relationship is too simple. There's nothing for us to really do. Okay. So clearly I would fill in that word cold. And I suppose, I mean, to be fair, the GRE could give you this and just have really fancy words for cold, right? But probably not. Probably not. The reason I point this out is that this is what a lot of people are expecting. They're expecting when they see neither nor, but, although, while, those kind of directional markers, they're expecting a simple contradiction. Sometimes I'll see something like this. Uh, the food was hot yet blank, and people just put in a contradiction, hot yet cold. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. I mean, I guess food can be hot in one place and cold in another. I guess I've had that, right? It's burnt on the top and it's still frozen in the middle, right? But unless we're saying that, it's like contradictory. The movie was good yet bad. Well, they're probably not going to directly contradict themselves. And sometimes, like, again, something could, I guess, be hot and cold or good or bad. Some things can't be true, right? Something can't be available and not, or, someone can't be alive but dead or something like that. So watch out for the assumption that when you have a contradiction like a yet, a but, an although, that it's just going to be a simple like nuh-uh, because it's the same author writing it. So unless they're describing someone else's opinion, my wife thinks it's too hot in here, but I think it's too cold. Okay, then we can disagree, but we're not going to say she thinks it's you know hot but cold. Um, Now what about the second one? The play was long and blank as far as I was concerned. Why isn't the GRE going to give us this? Yeah, it's a little vague, isn't it? The play was long and what? I feel like I'd have to guess. Um, I could say, oh, it was long and boring. That would make sense. Uh, Uninformative, bad, but it could also be, I don't know, long and relaxing. Uh, Long and epic in scope, right? I don't know. it was long and fun, right? The only way they could give me this would be if there was only one word that could fit this context at all, right? But given the sentence the way it's written, other than short, there's not much I can say that I know is wrong. So it could be almost anything. So that's not what they're going to do. There might be some doubt sometimes, like if I said the play was so blank that we walked out, then you at least know it's something bad. And it could be offensive or it could be boring or it could be loud, but it would just be something that would make you walk out. And maybe there's only one. Maybe, the other words are something that means like beautiful or something that means, well written. And you're like, well, why'd you walk out? Right. And there's only one that sounds offensive or bad. But generally it's going to be more specific than that. And it doesn't mean we can always predict the exact idea, but that we ought to have some clues. And so on the one hand, they're not just going to hand you the exact thing on a silver platter. But on the other hand, they're not just going to leave you twisting, usually. There can be subtleties and complications. But generally speaking, there's got to be some kind of clue and then often a marker of how we're moving in relation to that clue. So I want to do a few without the answers that are more legitimate to see what kind of things the GRE does ask you to do other than simple opposition. So these are generally going to be things that feature some kind of direction marker so we can sort of tell where we're going. Okay. So let's do a couple of these at a time. And I just want you to think about what word you would fill in. Again, I don't care about the fancy side of like what exact word would it be, but just the idea of it. So take a moment to read these two. Okay. So let's think about what could go in each of these. So for the first one, any ideas? What could I put? Unlike the politician's earlier evasions and equivocations, might not know what that means, but okay. This latest statement is blank lie. What could I put there? Interesting. Something about being direct, something about being blatant. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting, right? Because someone could say, well, wait, if before the politician, if I know that evasion and equivocation, maybe I don't know exactly the dictionary definition of equivocation, but maybe it sounds like someone who's trying to get out of something. Maybe I would just say it's not a lie. But wait a second, is that unlike? Because if I evade something, technically I'm already not lying, I'm just not answering. Like, let's say I was teaching the GRE, but I'd never taken it. And so when my students asked me, hey, what was your GRE score? I would change the subject or go, oh, well, that's what we're all interested in, huh? It's getting that score. Or let me tell you, I didn't miss a single geometry problem. But none of those are lies necessarily. They just don't get it like, okay, did you take it? What was your score? Right. So I don't want to put not a lie, but maybe it's more subtle. Maybe it's earlier he was avoiding saying the truth in different ways. But now, yeah, he's telling a blatant lie. He's just flat out saying, like, yeah, I got a perfect GRE score when he hasn't taken it, kind of thing, right? And so it's a subtler difference than just this is the opposite. Right? An equivocation is like when you're playing with language to mean two different things. Um, okay. So then what about this next one? Her vast pile of purple curls is so distinctive and eye-catching that blank failed to notice when she enters a room. What would you put there? Yeah, few people, right? Um, it could be some variation on that. The main thing I want to get out here, I think this was not too hard for some of you to figure out. But what's interesting about this one is that it's less about the content clues in this case and more of, well, let me put that better. We get content clues about her and noticing when she enters, but that the part we're filling in is more the direction marker itself. Do you fail to notice or do you not fail to notice? Oh, you do not fail to notice. You do notice. It's a double negative, right? And so it's recognizing that sometimes the fill in is itself the marker, right? So we say, oh, let's see, if she's distinctive and eye catching, then you should notice. So what do we know about failing to notice? Oh, that shouldn't happen. We want a negative. We want a negative marker. Okay, great. Let's do a couple more. See how you'd fill these in. Okay, so partly just recognizing the kind of phrasing. So here's a slightly more maybe you could say less common direction marker for all. So if I say for all the students' meticulous preparation, he received blank grade, what should that say? Yeah, it's going to have to be a bad grade, right? Um, because for all means basically like even though this happened, right? For all his protesting, he ended up going along with it anyway, right? So he protested all he wanted, but he still did it, right? So here for all the preparation, they still got a bad grade. Um, when we had answer choices in this one of the answer choices was something like passing, which, for a lot of us isn't that exciting, right? If you're trying to get A's and you get a passing grade, you're like, well, great, I passed, but like it's not a good grade, right? It's not going to do wonders for my GPA. Um, but that still wouldn't create the right contrast we want, for all the preparation he did, he passed, but it passed his phrase positively. If it said merely a passing grade, that might work because it's emphasizing the negativity of it, right? Everyone views things differently. One person's excited to get a B or a C, and the other person's horrified. Right? So if I said for all the students' preparation, he received only a passing grade or a so-so grade or a mediocre grade, it's emphasizing the lack of greatness, the glass is half empty part. I could do that. Otherwise, I would just want to say a poor or a bad, an abysmal score. So, okay. And then what about this one? Unlike the noxious spray of a skunk, right? If I just had one blank, I might just be like, this scent was great. This scent was nice. Unlike a skunk spray, this perfume is lovely, right? But what if I say this scent was blank but blank? What could they be going for here? Okay. But I can't contrast unlike, right? I'm seeing the first back should contrast unlike. Do you mean it should contrast the noxious spray part? Like, do I want a pleasant word in the first blank? So it's kind of hard to know without more information, right? So it could be like, hey, look, a skunk spray is nasty, right? This scent was pleasant, but then what would be the second part? Well, it can't go back to noxious because then it wouldn't be true. It was unlike the noxious spray, right? See if I put this in. If I say, unlike the noxious spray of a skunk, this scent was pleasant but noxious, then I'd be saying, unlike noxious, it is noxious. I can't do that. Can't do that. And it would have to still be pleasant. And something pleasant isn't noxious. Noxious is gross, right? So yeah, it could be something like strong, but that's confusing too because isn't a skunk spray strong? They didn't say that, but we know it is, right? So I don't know if I want strong either. It would have to be something pleasant, but that undermines the pleasantness. Like um maybe something like cloying, which is like when something's so sweet that it's kind of bothers you, right? Or pleasant, but uh short-lived, right? Skunk spray is nasty and long-lived, and this one is maybe short-lived. But it's hard to know whether that's right because there's no clue talking about things like that. Right? So it seems a little vague still, and I might have to rely on the vocab that they give me. Another possibility I want to suggest, and this is more like if I were going to write answers for this is what I'd write. I would actually have unpleasant here. So bear with me. You'd say, wait, isn't the noxious spray of a skunk unpleasant? Yes, but what could I fill into the second one that would make that make sense? If I'm comparing something to a noxious spray of a skunk, what if I have another scent that's unpleasant, but what? Yeah, Megan. Bearable, right? Tolerable, something like that. So this is kind of like, again, if I haven't written the answers to this one, but if I were going to, that's what I'd be going for. It's not impossible to imagine an answer where it's pleasant, but I think a more likely GRE path that they're going to give you in the answers is, look, how is this different? So what I'm getting at is subtleties of contrast. It's not always as simple as, hey, this is noxious and I want unlike, so I want something that's good. It could be like, oh, it's bad in another way. Um, and so sometimes we don't know when we're seeing a whole contrast, which part we're contrasting, right? Um, like if I said, unlike me, a tall middle-aged man, this other person, you're like, well, which part are they contrasting? Height, age, gender? Like, which part are we talking about? Maybe both of us are men, and I'm talking about, some other characteristic, right? So we've got to be a little open to what they're contrasting, but be careful about just straight contradiction. Oh, this says bad, I want good, right? They're often a little subtler than that. Okay. Let's try one just for variety with some answer choices to it. So in this one, I'll give you a sentence equivalence. So if you haven't done this before, sentence equivalence, you pick two. And the important thing about picking two here is that they have to fit the sentence in the same way. So you don't want to pick two words that both work in the blank independently. You want to pick two words that both would have the same effect or have the same basic meaning when plugged into the sentence. Okay. So give this a try, and you could just private chat me your two-letter answers when you're ready. So take about a minute to do this. Okay, let's have those answers. Okay, cool. So here we have one that does kind of follow the negative. So what we have to do is recognize that one way they'll sometimes give you content is to say what something wasn't, right? Um, so here they said he parroted, so he's copying, right? Adding nothing new. So then if we look at the first part, it's also negative, was in no way blank. I could just say the word new. So sometimes it's actually this weird thing where they're saying what he didn't do, but the second part also said what he didn't do. So you stay negative, right? But you stay negative about the positive trait he doesn't have. So I can make it sound more confusing than you probably found it. A lot of you probably just got this and saw it was right. But notice all your kind of juggling of this kind of balance, right? That you're saying the clue tells us what he did not do. The first part also says something he didn't do. So if it says no way, then I want the thing that's lacking, the thing that he isn't providing. He isn't providing something novel. He isn't providing something fresh, right? And notice what they have is the opposite. Derivative and hackneyed are the exact opposite. That's what he maybe is doing. Derivative and hackneyed things are where you're copying or working off something's already been done. Tangentious and even-handed don't have anything to do with this content. Okay. This okay? Okay. Um, And of course, there's still a vocab issue here, right? If you said, "Hey, I don't know novel in this context," or "I didn't know what hackneyed meant," or something, that makes it harder. And of course, we want to keep learning vocabulary. And I'd recommend making flashcards from things. I don't tend to, in a workshop, I don't tend to define a lot of words because we want to watch the time, and I know you can look them all up. But definitely keep lists of words that you encounter. So aside from any vocabulary lists you're working from or any prefab flashcards you have, it's really good to study words that you've actually encountered in the wild because those are more memorable from the context. Okay. And a lot of times there will be words we don't know and we just don't care, right? I've seen words I don't know on the actual GRE and still gotten the questions right because I knew they weren't the answer. So who cares what they say, right? If I know what the answer is, then I don't care what that other word is. So it doesn't mean I don't want to study it later and learn it, but I don't need to know all the words to get it right. And that's, needs to be part of your strategy for sure. Okay. Let's try a couple more fill-ins just for thematic purposes. So take a moment to think about what could go into these. All right. What do we got? For most of the 20th century, American political contentions reflected pragmatic rather than ideological differences. Candidate debates centered around whether programs were blank. Okay. Yeah. So here's one where again we have the semicolon. And so often what you see with the semicolon is just paralleling, right? They said that we want to be pragmatic rather than ideological. And the rather than is important because pragmatic is the one that we actually did do, we were interested in, and ideological is the one that we didn't want, right? So, things have, I think, changed a little bit in politics, right? And we're not just worried about whether something can be done. We disagree about whether it should be done, right? Um, but so in this case, the debates were centered around whether you could do something, right? So you could simply recycle the word or use another word like practical, doable, etc. Yeah. Okay. And then the second one, because Lewis and Clark expedition through the West was conceived primarily as a magic mapping project, government officials were blank by the wealth of information on a myriad of topics that the explorers gathered. Notice once again here, we don't have a lot of direction markers. Um, we see a difference here that was conceived one way, but there was a wealth of information on a lot of topics. Um, and so we see a contrast. There's also the word because. And so we can say, all right, because we thought of it as a mapping project, they were something by the wealth of information. Okay, so we want something like surprised. We want something that suggests, hey, they didn't see that coming. Now, does that make these easy? Well, of course, it depends on the vocab and the answer choices. But again, if we don't have those fill-ins, we're going to have a hard time, dealing with that vocab when we get to it. Okay. And it's pretty common that I will see people miss a question where they know every single word. I've even had an entire class do this. I'll have an entire class work on a problem, and everyone will get it wrong, even though everyone in the class tells me they know all the words, right? That can happen. Okay. So let's pick up the pace a little bit and we'll do a few problems where we're focusing on how do you predict, how do you get the answers, right? So let me give you this one. Since it's just a simple A through E, I'll give you a poll. All right. Getting a few different answers here. So put something in before we talk about it. Make sure you've got something committed. Um, so here we have some fun words. Bifurcated aesthetic is lovely. Some people feel like they know exactly what that means. Other people will say that's a blank. So let's see if we got anything else. Like other artists, they strive to represent the truth. So portrait artists are also striving to represent the truth. But so that's an interesting setup. Even if I hadn't, like, let's say I hadn't even read this part, right? Let's say this part weren't even here. If it just said, like other artists, portrait painters strive to represent the truth, but say, okay, somehow they're failing to, or there's some other thing that's going on other than trying to represent the truth. But commerce dictates that they simultaneously employ a subtle blank that make the likeness more attractive than the sitter. That's interesting. Make the likeness more attractive than the sitter. So they're saying the painting has to be prettier than me, right? If I hire you to paint a picture of me, I'm like, paint it real, man. Show me the way I look. But I want it to look good. I don't want to look ugly, right? And so the painting still has to look a little bit better than I do, right? Even though I'm asking for honesty. So there's an interesting bit of contradiction there. And so what we can see is there's almost a paradox or a conflict between two goals. So I need something that's, you know, maybe tricks, lies, something that goes against being truthful. And in that case, I can get rid of some of these answers. Palettes are about colors, right? Sure, painters use palettes, right? But that's not aesthetics. They use that word but aesthetics is just art, basically. It's right. Artistic traits or artistic principles or things like that, right? Doesn't I might use them in some way in my work, um, but it's nothing about it doesn't go in a direction. And that's one thing to watch in general with predictions is they shouldn't be bland, neutral things. They should show you which direction we're going. Sentiments, I don't know even how to employ a sentiment, right? Artifacts and artifices sound very similar, but an artifact is an object, an artifice is a fakery, right? And so basically it's like it's using fake things, right? Ways of faking to make someone look, nicer than they might in real life. Okay. So that's another example of like sort of the subtle contradictions you can see, right? It doesn't say they tell the truth, but they lie exactly. But it's like, okay, so we're trying to be truthful, but we have to do things that are at least a little subtly fake so it's still presentable. Okay. Do some more. Let's talk before we look at the answers on how we'd fill this one in. The Tasmanian devil is not considered blank, since only a few of its confrontations with humans have been blank. Hmm. Not a ton to go. Any ideas? Okay. So it's saying it hasn't been considered blank because a few have been blank. So they could be kind of the same direction, right? It could be, hey, the Tasmanian devil is not considered like evil or dangerous because only a few of its confrontations have been harmful, right? Now you might think, well, but if a few have, that still could be evil or dangerous, right? Or maybe it's evil, it's just not that strong, right? Like, I don't know, maybe cats are evil, they're just not strong enough to kill me or something, right? But it could be something like that. Notice I can also just be a little off about the content. Let's say I'd never heard of a Tasmanian devil. Hey, maybe you haven't, right? Um, maybe you didn't know that was a kind of mammal, right? And you're like, the devil, okay, maybe it's not considered real because few of its confrontations have been documented, right? So like we're not sure we've ever seen this. I could see going for that. That's not what they want. It's a real animal, so some real world knowledge would be nice here. But it would also be a matter of, are those answers there, right? If those answers were there, if there was one that said real and one that said documented, well, okay, they've set you up to answer that then, but they're probably not going to do that. So we'd have to think about it. It's going to be something like this, where the blanks one seems to support the other, right? In that if few things have been two, then you don't consider the animal two, and so one and two should probably match. But you might see when you go to the answers a little bit of subtlety. So go ahead and try this and click, message me your two letters when you got it. All right, let's see what we got. Okay. Yeah, so if we're looking at these, I could just try to look at one by itself. I could say adverse. I know things can have adverse effects, but I don't think an animal can be adverse. Unpredictable, I'll have to hold off on. Maybe it's unpredictable or not unpredictable. I'll have to see. Menacing is like dangerous evil. It fits that. I kind of like menacing. Let me look at the second one. Only a few of its confrontations have been premature. I don't know what that would mean here, right? Why would a confrontation be premature? Quixotic, you might treat that as a blank if you're like, I don't know what that means, right? It happens and it means like weird, quirky. It comes from Don Quixote of all things, right? But I don't have to know that to then say unprovoked. Oh, that's interesting. I didn't see that coming as far as harmful, but oh, if few of their confrontations have been unprovoked, that means when a Tasmanian devil bites you, it's probably because you're messing with it. And so if they only bite you when you're messing with them, then maybe they're not a threat. And so now I can see more what they're going for. They're saying, hey, few of their confrontations, whoops, that was supposed to be see-through. Da, da, da. Few of their confrontations have been unprovoked, so they don't attack you out of nowhere. Now that could nudge me toward unpredictable. But I don't know. There's so many ways to be unpredictable, right? Just because a Tasmanian devil doesn't bite us too much when it's unprovoked doesn't mean that it's predictable. Maybe I still don't know what it will do. Plus, maybe every now and then it does attack unprovoked. So I don't know much about predictability. What I know is that it's not super menacing. It's not like, I don't know, let's say a lion that might charge me out of nowhere. It's probably only going to mess with me if I mess with it. Okay. That all right? Try some more. I'm going to give you a couple at a time, so you got to go at whatever pace you want. Uh, take about 2 minutes, and then we'll talk about these. Chat me in your answers when you have. All right, let's see what we got. Okay. So first one's really interesting. It's saying that this guy's upbringing had no effect on his policy. So somehow his upbringing, we can tell, has to be at odds with his policy. But we don't know in what way until we see this other thing. So then what is he advocating? Isolationism. Um, okay. So what does that have to do with anything then? Okay, so if you're into isolationism, that means you don't want to be, say, international. You don't want to, include others from elsewhere, right? Um, and so what we have to think about is like we might see something that seems like politically a fit, like the word liberal, right? And maybe you have an association with that. Maybe you're like, oh, liberals are less isolationist than conservatives or something like that. But first off, these don't require us to know a whole lot about which positions are liberal and conservative. Hey, they don't require you to be particularly political aware and politically aware and like what country are we talking about? Is it the US? Is it someplace else? So liberal is more like a theme trap, right? Like, hey, this is about politics, right? And he had a liberal upbringing, but he didn't act liberal. Um, and you could argue also that there could be liberal policies that would be isolationist. Maybe some liberals want to focus on domestic things more, even though their positions on those are liberal, right? So what I want more is something that's, you know, not isolationist. Uh, maybe something like international, collaborative, something like that. Now the words get kind of tough, right? You might not know what all these means. I mean, we've seen tangentius twice now, so you might want to look that one up. Um, but what we want here, if it stands out to you, is cosmopolitan, right? This implies someone who, is worldly, gets around, travels, connects to people in different places, right? Okay. Um, so a little bit sneaky, right? Uh, But if I can get rid of even some of the answers, like if opulent is like fancy, like an opulent mansion is like you have a lot of like gold, jewels, and stuff like that, then that has nothing to do with whether you're isolationist. You could have grown up in a fancy mansion and be for or against internationalism. Okay. So then we have the double blank in the second one. In her opening remarks, the school's director empathized with the apparent blank of taking disciplinary action in the classroom. Okay, so the apparent blank of taking a disciplinary action. Okay, at this point, I have no idea. Like, there's no way to tell the use, the value, the trouble, the um, difficulty. I just don't know. So then I see something interesting. I see on the one hand, okay, so there's going to be a contrast. On the one hand, teachers can ill afford to blank disruptive behaviors, while on the other, strict administration could foster such behaviors. So we can see a contrast here. Let's go to the part that is not got a blanket in, right? Strict administration can foster such behaviors. What do they mean? Bad behaviors, right? So if I'm super strict, that can foster the exact behavior I'm trying to get rid of. So I want to watch whenever they say like such or these or those, we want to say, what do I mean? Oh, disruptive behavior. So they're saying that if you're really strict, that can actually make people disruptive. Um, on the other hand, you can't afford to blank disruptive behavior. So what would be a contrast there? Forgetting the language in the answers, which is kind of fancy. What regular old English word would you put in for number two? Yeah, right. Something other than being overall overly strict, right? Um, Now we don't want stop because that would be the strict part, or at least we're trying to, right? So there's you can afford to stop disruptive behavior. And if anything, and if you couldn't, it would be in the contrast part that they're saying that if you're too strict, that can cause a problem, right? So they're saying you can't ignore, you can't afford to ignore, allow, tolerate, which kind of those could sound really different, but they kind of go together, right? If you ignore something, then you're not doing anything about it, you're allowing it to go forward, right? I think of my really nice high school teacher that had a really rough, one of the periods was really rough. And people would make her cry, and she was so nice. She didn't want to be super strict and mean, and she wasn't. But then she would let these bratty kids walk all over her, right? And so we got to watch that distinction. Sometimes I was that nice teacher too. We got to watch that sometimes. So we're saying, look, you can't you can't let people just go wild in your class. But if you're super strict, that could actually encourage them to do that. Okay. So then what's going on in one? There's an apparent notice that the director is empathizing, which implies there's something that's going to be hard, right? I'm not going to empathize just with like how great your life is, right? They're going to empathize with the apparent blank of taking disciplinary action, right? And so I'm going to need some kind of like word that implies like trouble, difficulty of balance. I don't necessarily know what the exact word I need, but something that's going to imply a dilemma of some kind. Okay. So then the words get kind of fancy. But I can say, okay, it's not necessity because that doesn't cover. Notice you could argue that it is necessary to use discipline, but it doesn't cover the contradiction that we see. Entreaty is just when you plea for someone to do something. That doesn't work. So it leads us to the paradox. Paradox is kind of a strong word, but it's something that's contradictory, right? The classic paradox is I'm lying to you right now. Well, wait, if you're lying, then you're lying about lying, so you aren't lying. So you're telling, right? So it's something that doesn't seem possible, doesn't make sense. Um, and then what do we want here? We might not know all these words, but fabricate means to make something, sometimes even to make it up, like to lie, but it can also just be to build like a factory. Um, Mitigate is to actually lessen. Um, and so they're not saying you can't afford to lessen the behavior or make it better. Whereas brook is a fancy word to mean tolerate, put up with, right? For some reason, the most common phrase I've heard with that is, I will brook no insubordination. It's a fancy way for a manager to say, I won't put up with anyone, talking back to me or going against my commands. Okay. Well, I hope this gets you some ideas about directionality in our thinking. Let me give you one more pair to talk about. Uh, these will be sentence equivalents. So for each of these, pick two, right? And remember that the two have to match each other too, not just the blank. They have to both mean roughly the same thing in the context of the sentence. All right, take a couple minutes for these, and then we'll talk and wrap up. All right, let's have those answers. Just give me two for each. Make it easier. You can use letters. So this would be A, B, C, D, E, F, G, right? Sorry, there's no G. Haha. Like that. So what do we know? So here we've first one we've got in uncertain times, blank theories often gain greater and faster adherence than proven ones do. So we see a contrast, uh, greater and faster than. And so if we're talking about and notice there's also this repeat like we saw with those behaviors or this or that or these, right? So when they say ones, they're talking about theories. So they're saying, okay, we want something like unproven theories, right? Unproven theories apparently gain faster adherence than proven ones do. That sounds about right from what I've seen in the world. Um, okay, so I need something that means that it's not proven. Um, I have to be careful because incorrect, it's nice, but hey, there's a difference between it's not for sure, we don't know, versus it's wrong. Okay. Um, corroborated is the opposite. Corroborated basically means proven. Irrefutable means absolutely true. Like that's stronger. It doesn't have a match at all. Irrefutable means like there's no way you could refute it. It's definitely, definitely true without fail, right? That's a pretty strong statement to make in general, but there's no match for that, and it goes the wrong way. Um, irreconcilable means it can't be matched to something else. That's not clear what it would mean here. So we want these two. Putative and conjectural both mean like, hey, someone thinks it's true, it's the case, they're proposing it, it's their idea, it's their theory, it's their not even theory, it's their hypothesis. But that they, we don't know for sure. Okay, great. Then my dad did his PhD on Proust, so he'd be very proud that I'm ending with Proust. Okay. Proust proved that the blank can be the domain of the novel every bit as much as the fantastical can be. So I chose this one because we have this every bit as much. Notice again, when you think about which direction to go, that could sound like it's the same, right? Like I love her every bit as much as she loves me, kind of thing. So that they're the same. But even that, notice that there's still a contrast. One is me loving her, and her loving me. The other is her loving me. It's different direction, right? So if we're saying this is every bit as much that, often we're saying there's difference in some way, right? It would be like if I said, short kids have every bit as much right to play basketball as tall kids, right? I'm saying they're different. I'm just saying we shouldn't treat them differently. So we want something that's not fantastical. Otherwise, we wouldn't be making much of a statement. If they said the magical can be as much as the fantastical, you'd say, aren't those the same? So we want something that shows that contrast. And so literary is a trap. Yes, we're talking about literature, but that doesn't tell us what the author is writing about. Bombastic, no. I'm using the wrong thing. Cosmopolitan doesn't contrast with fantastical. We've seen that word twice now too. Belletristic also matches literary. It's a trap. Whereas mundane and quotidian, speaking of Proust, quotidian is from French, just means every day, basically. And so these are like the ordinary, the humdrum, the everyday. That gives us a contrast that we want. Okay, so I hope this was useful to get you thinking about directional markers and the subtleties that are there. We're usually not just straight up disagreeing with whatever was said or saying the exact opposite. We're looking for subtle shadings of what they might be contrasting sometimes. We're also avoiding certain kinds of trap fill-ins, things that are just content traps or things that are too vague and neutral, like, hey, he wrote literature, but like what kind of literature? What was he describing? Um, and we're looking at for subtleties in the way that the contrasts are phrased or presented to you. Okay. So I will stop there. Stick around if you have any questions for me. If not, love to see you in one of our classes, and of course in any of our future prep hours. And if you want to check out the rest of them on YouTube, there's plenty of us talking to go around. Um, and again, hope everyone enjoyed. Hope you found this useful. If you have any comments, questions, anything you want to say, let me know. Other than that, best of luck and have a great holiday time.